Welcome to Schola Equestris, the podcast for mounted combat, historical horsemanship, and classical dressage. Today, I'll be talking with Mike Canfor. Mike is a lifelong horseman, independent researcher, and historian with an emphasis on the medieval period in Western Europe, particularly focusing on equine and equestrian history. In addition, he brings practical experience to this as he has extensive equestrian training in Portugal with an internationally renowned dressage and working equitation rider. Mike has also jousted with historically accurate solid lances, including open field jousting within the UK and wider in Europe. He also teaches rossfechten. I met Mike through a mutual friend, Dominic Sewell, a couple years ago when I first visited England to participate in an armored combat workshop. At that time, I did not know of Mike's extensive riding history, as the focus of that weekend was on armored combat. More recently, we spent the weekend together again at Historic Equitation for another clinic weekend, focusing this time on mounted combat. After hearing his full story and having a chance to train with him, I thought we should settle down to discuss some of his fascinating research on the medieval horse. All right, very good. Let's get started. So, Mike, thanks again for joining us on the podcast. Very excited to talk to you about some of your work, both regarding horse nutrition and care in the Middle Ages, as well as a little bit more about the Iberian horse, where you are in England. So let's just go ahead and get started. I like to do the rapid fire questions first. Are you ready for those?
Go for it. Yep. Go.
Very good. So where in the world are you?
I am in Norfolk in the UK. So the bit that sticks out on the right-hand side as you look at England.
Very good. And did you ride as a child, or was horse riding something you learned as an adult?
Yeah, no, I was really fortunate. I had a pony as a child. Both my parents were horsey. They met through horses, and I didn't even have to ask. I got a pony when I was younger. Didn't appreciate it as an 8-year-old boy wouldn't. So I then relearned as an adult about 17 or 18, but that sense of familiarity and affiliation and affection to horses has always been with me. You know, one of my earliest memories is like the smell of horses. So a very, very nice, fond memory.
So sounds like you've always kind of been a horse person, and then later on developed a specific interest.
Yeah. I mean, as I grew up, there was always a lot of positivity around horses because my grandparents were army riders, and the whole family basically had some involvement with equestrianism. So there was a lot of positivity when I was young around horses and familiarity, which is obviously very interesting if you are an equestrian who doesn't come from a horsey background. You have to go a step into a world that is potentially a bit, maybe alien. For me, horses were just, something that was a good, positive thing.
Yeah, I know it can be very intimidating for people who don't grow up with an equine background, and then as an adult, try to get into it. So where then did the swords and armor and mounted combat part fit in?
I don't know. Dreams of being a knight as a little boy, a young boy. But I'm fascinated by the power and the flexibility of what a horse would give you in a combat situation. So, working with the animal and having that kind of bond of trust and schooling. And I think I always was aware that there was more to it than just a flat out cavalry charge where, they rode at the enemy in a nonsensical kind of way. I mean, that has its uses, obviously, but I was always aware of this kind of this intricate and, developed sort of way of riding. And I thought sort of mounted combat in terms of being at one with a horse was something that was really kind of a pinnacle of the art. And whether that's you're doing working equitation, whether you're doing high level dressage or whatever, whether you're riding in combat, that's something that's kind of really appealed to me of being at one with the animal.
I agree, and I think there's probably nowhere we better see that that bond between human and horse than in a potentially a war situation, or perhaps the only thing that's similar today is as we might get into later, in Spain or Portugal when you talk about horse against bull
Yeah,
and
yeah,
what that looks like now.
yeah,
Similar importance to be trained to a certain
yeah.
level, right, to even
Absolutely,
survive.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, and I've got a first-hand experience of that, of riding bullfighting horses, bullfighting lessons, and go into a big bullfight in central Portugal, and the traditions there. So, but yeah, as you said, we can touch on that later. So no problems.
Yeah. All right, and then final rapid fire question: if you could go back in time and visit one historical horse person, who would it be?
Well, there's three big names that jump out at me, and it's William Marshall, Jordanus Rufus from the veterinary side of things, but I think probably it'd be William Cavendish. I think it would be the Duke of Newcastle because he really was a true horseman. He loved his horses for the sake of it. He was constantly broke paying for them, which I know exactly how he feels. But he was also quite a progressive person. I wouldn't call him a liberal, but he was not. He wasn't a misogynistic person. I didn't come across to be like that for that age. He was quite liberated in the way that he supported his wife's poetry and writing and things like that. So there's good sides to him, but he absolutely loved his horses. And I spent a lot of time. I've been very lucky to spend a lot of time in the riding house at Bolsover doing displays, and it is one of it's tiny, but it's one of the most amazing places to ride that I've ever ridden because the atmosphere is just so still and so calm, and it's lovely. You can almost feel like he's kind of watching you. But yeah, so I think that would be him. I'd really like to have a conversation with the Duke of Newcastle.
Yeah, as having also been to Bolsover myself, I can
Yeah,
definitely agree
yeah,
about that feel in the riding house. And the majority of us will never have the opportunity to ride in a historical riding
mm,
house like that. There's just not many, left in
no,
the world. So I think that's really special.
yeah.
All right, so then we'll switch gears here, and I want to first talk about some of the research you've been doing about care, feeding in the Middle Ages, and what that looked like, how it maybe differed from how we care for our horses now. So, overall, what did the diet of a horse look like in medieval England?
Well, so yeah, obviously, horses are biological animals that haven't really changed much in the past 500 years in terms of their core needs. They're still fiber and roughage-driven animals, so it would be very recognisable to us today. So you're obviously looking at they were aware of the large amounts of forage and fiber that were needed, such as hay, um, grass, and other bits and pieces like that. But obviously they were aware that you needed to supplement a horse's feed depending on the type of work that it did. So they were aware that oats and other cereals were beneficial. Um, Nowadays, we roll oats, we crack the surface of them and other grains to actually partially break them down, so it's easier for a horse to digest it. Because obviously, horses in the wild have a quite a varied diet. From they if you watch them and they're in a more natural meadow, they will glean the hedgerows as well as eat just pure grass. So they're selective in what they eat like that. But they haven't really got a digestive system that can cope with really solid cereals. So we roll oats nowadays. But they didn't back then. No mention of that. Barley was something that they didn't feed because they didn't really roll it or clean it. So the ears were known to sort of be a bit damaging to the horse's digestive system. They were fed to cattle. And that comes from a lovely 13th century book written by a book on husbandry written by Walter of Henley, who was writing a sort of a steward's book to manage a household. There's lots of good bits and pieces in there. So no barley, oats, bran. Sometimes they mix the oats and the bran together, and you could buy it in what we'd call today a mix. So you go to your local feed store and you buy a bag of mix with all the cereals and feeds in it today. So they had pre-weighed, pre-mixed bran and oats as straight feeds, and they were the most common things. So there were other bits and pieces as well that seem a little bit bizarre to us, and I think we want to talk about that in a bit. But they fed cut grass, which is mentioned quite extensively in some of the household stud accounts for the royal studs. And they fed bread, horse bread as well, which is something we obviously don't do today.
Yeah, so it sounds like overall mostly similar. I mean, lots of
Mm,
roughage, lots of time spent grazing,
yeah,
and they supplemented just as we do today.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Oats, sure, similar, but
yeah,
then yeah, the I don't know if I want to talk about the horse bread or the cut grass first because both of those are very interesting.
yeah.
let's talk maybe first about horse bread. So for anyone who's
Okay.
never heard that term, has no idea what it is,
Yep.
what the heck is it?
So it's bread. Um, but it's not made with glutinous cereals as we make bread today with wheat, which would be very bad for horses because it would clog their digestive systems and they would struggle to get through that much like glutinous type material. So we know it's made from beans and peas because of regulation um, within places like York and London. I think there's a 14th century statute of the city of London that basically says it's got to be made from beans and peas. Um, and later on, Gervais Markham gives recipes, but he puts lots of stuff in, like straw and bits of chopped roughage as well. Um, but certainly earlier on in the medieval period, it was pure beans and peas, and it was regulated just as any other guild or trade in cities was regulated. So it was. Controlled by the local authorities in terms of how much it needed to weigh per loaf, how much it was, how much material was used to actually create it in terms, and that in relation to the cost of the raw material. So basically, so people couldn't overcharge. So there was a basic level of quality that was set for say big cities like York, London, other places. Excuse me, and yeah, occasionally it's mentioned as being fed to poor people as well. So it's seen as a sort of lesser form of bread, but obviously it's got the benefits of being it's preserved and transportable. So it's easy to move around rather than a sack of um, straight straights that could be spilt. So you can just obviously drop it and pick it up again. It's not a problem. But yeah, it's ubiquitous as well. It's mentioned in a lot of places like household accounts and other places where it's fed to horses.
So it sounds like it would have been quite dense. Beans and peas would have been high protein.
Yep, yep.
So a protein supplement in a sense. And then,
Mm,
right, as you mentioned, I guess that probably would have made it much easier to transport a higher volume, higher amount of
yeah,
calorie amount of food
yeah.
than the raw ingredients, certainly.
I mean, I haven't I
Um,
haven't crossed anything yet in terms of details. That's just something I would like to find out is whether it was just fed broken down or just chucked in front of them, or whether they actually kind of tried to sort of soften it a bit with water or something like that. I don't know. I think that'd be interesting to look into further. I haven't tried to make any myself. I've seen people occasionally. I think there's one person out there on the internet who's tried to bake it, but I haven't done that myself. So, but yeah, it was everywhere really.
yeah. No, it would be interesting to see someone, yeah, look further into to trying to come up with a modern version of the recipe.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm sort of imagining it's like a horse protein bar, right? That
Yeah, that sort of thing. I think it's concentrated, isn't it? But it's very practical in the way it's transported and uh, yeah, easily moved, stored.
Mhm.
You can buy it in any, yeah, you can buy it or you can take it with you, that kind of thing. So
Yeah, and I suppose maybe like horses today who are all can be very particular about the way they want their feed. I'm sure there was a variety of ways of feeding it,
yeah,
depending on the animal.
yeah, yeah. But
Um, and as far as we know, that was a pretty widespread thing, right? It wasn't just England, but other places were feeding it as
as
well.
far as I'm aware, yeah. I mean, obviously, most of my research being English, most of my research is focused on England. But yeah, I think it's across Europe. It's known. I think most ideas like that spread fairly easily. So unless there's a specific region, a reason in that you can't grow peas or beans very easily, then I think they would probably certainly be feeding it in places like France and more temperate climates where that crop is easily manageable.
Hmm. I suppose that's then a challenge out there to our listeners. Is there anyone out there who has made horse bread? And yeah, send us your recipe. Give us some
What did it
pictures.
come out like? Did it taste all right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Did you try
Yeah.
it? All right. And so then let's talk then about the cut grass because I think that's really, really interesting. Is that,
Yeah.
it's sort of the opposite of what we would think of today, where, freshly cut grass potentially could mold or become toxic for horses, whereas they're recommending it, sounds like specifically for their performance horses.
Yeah. Yeah. So this came up in a translation of some of the or transcription of some of the royal stud records and it was written by somebody who wasn't a horse person per se in terms of they didn't have an awareness of that kind of inbuilt equestrian knowledge that we know. And it comes up quite a lot, and it's being fed to breeding stallions and horses that are in harder work where they're needing extra calories. So I think they're really aware that grass is obviously more nutritious than hay, and they need to give it to them when they're working a bit harder. And I think Walter of Henley as well recommends plough horses get it, because they're obviously pulling the plough hard all day long, so they get he recommends them getting certain amounts of grass as well. But I think if we think about it in terms of the way we cut our grass, like I need to cut mine tonight, so it's going to be quite short, it's going to be full of sugar, and the density of the clippings when left are going to easily ferment and mold. And they will if you leave them. If I left it in the lawnmower bin, it would probably be moldy on a warm day the next day, and that's obviously very bad for horses in terms of colic, gaseous ailments, or botulism, all sorts of horrible things. So we know as modern equestrians that you don't feed cut grass, you feed hay. But obviously we have haylage, which is slightly wilted grass that's cut when it's still green and then vacuum sealed, so it doesn't get a chance to decompose. And that's a great feed. That's what I feed all my horses on, because it's dry, it's nutritious. Well, it's not dry, so it's dust free, it's nutritious, and it's really good. And I think if we're thinking about cut grass in the medieval period, I think we're thinking of something that's more akin to haylage. So it's being harvested close to the land, close to the lands where the horses are kept, either on their lands or they're buying it in. It's being transported fairly quickly, and scythed grass is in its nature going to be quite a bit longer than trimmed lawn grass. So it's less likely to be able to ferment and cook up as easily, especially if there was a rudimentary management which is taken for granted, that you maybe turn it or sort of aerate it every couple of hours to help it stay fresh on the journey. And if it got there fairly quickly, then I think that's still going to retain a lot of its nutritional value without having the risk of decomposition, which is horses are prone to suffer from. So it's mentioned over and over again in multiple sources. I think they knew what they were doing. If horses were suddenly colicking and dying from eating cut grass, they would say, "Don't feed this." But I think it's more like haylage than lawn clippings. So in that case, it makes sense because it's being given to horses that are working harder and therefore need a bit more than just some potentially dry hay.
Right. And it seems like, too, then this would have been something that, when horses were at home or, traveling in larger cities, certainly easy to find. Maybe something like out on campaign, not so feasible. But
In terms of cut grass, yeah, I think there would be a lot of. I think there's one thing you've got to remember. I think with medieval life in general, and dealing with horses. So when you take a horse away to a horse show today, often you can be on your own unless you're lucky to have somebody to help you, and it can be a bit stressful. It's always more difficult taking a horse somewhere, dealing with it, having to do the thing that you're doing, i.e. riding, doing a dressage test, whatever, and then dealing with the horse. Where back in medieval times, there would be a lot more people around within a household. So there would be people who look after the horses. There would be people who groom them. There would be other people who are all horse savvy. So when you're managing horses away from home, it's much easier to go to the page or the groom, just graze that horse in hand, watch it. And I think there are, I can't remember where it comes from, but there's a minimum stipulation on numbers of horses that one person is supposed to be looking after. So in terms of feeding a horse on campaign or in a mobile situation, I think there's going to be more people around who are horse savvy who can actually just help them graze ad hoc in areas that they might not necessarily want to leave them unattended. And that's going to account for, I think there's going to be a lot of grazing on the hoof, so to speak. But in terms of getting fodder and foraging, yeah, absolutely. The marshals and the people that are arranging for accommodation and feed for the people are actually going to have to go ahead and find a lot of forage for the animals as well, for all sorts, for the oxen that are transporting heavier things like the guns as well as the horses. So it's a big logistical challenge, and I know from later periods it's really kind of curtailed the number of animals that can be moved around. I just got this vision of them like stripping the area clean and then having to move on very quickly. So obviously, if you're in a stationary situation like a siege, it's like a big problem, trying to feed your animals, let alone the people as well.
yeah, having that many people in
Yeah,
one place, and I'm sure very quickly exhausting the land in that
Yeah,
specific area.
yeah.
Yeah, just from grazing. Um, Obviously, I mean, we can assume that would have been a problem. But yeah, it is. It's interesting too to think like, were they, how did they calculate that? Obviously
Yeah,
someone was in charge of figuring out like, well, how much do we bring, and
yeah,
what is the limiting factor?
yeah. Well, I think the limiting factor is actually what you can actually take with you, because hay is like forage is. It's a difficult thing to transport unless you've got a mechanical means to compress it to a manageable size. So hay bales that we have today are obviously they're compressed and contained under pressure. They didn't have that technology. They stuffed them into barrels or bags and things like that. So the voluminous state of the amount of forage that you'd need would be vast in terms of wagons and things of actually trying to take it along with you. Um, so I think that
Yeah.
would probably be a significant factor in you've got an army of 5,000 people, and then you've got like 5,000 draft animals or whatever to actually just pull everything you need to feed the horses. So
Right, exactly. So for every, in order to move anything, you have animal drawn means of transportation,
exactly,
which means you're also paying for those
yeah,
animals that are
yeah,
moving the animal
yeah,
food.
yeah,
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 it's a
yeah.
compounding problem.
Becomes self-defeating at one point, I'm sure.
Yeah. But as far as you've looked, you haven't seen much in the sources as far as like how they actually logistically did that
Um,
campaign, have you?
no, not on campaign. That's a good area to look into. So I've read things like Howard's household accounts extensively, which is a large household at the upper echelons of English society, and he frequently moved around from one side of the country to the other. His main manor was in Suffolk, Stoke by Nayland, and he had properties and interests for the Crown in North Wales, which is literally across the other side of the Great Britain and north a bit as well. So it's quite a long way to go. So um, he's moving his household, which is dozens of people with their animals on a regular basis, and there's so many entries in there for what he terms horse meat, which isn't meat as in flesh of a horse, it's food. The medieval terminology for food was meat, so it's man's meat listed in there, and horse meat, and that's sometimes detailed out as well to be horse bread, hay, oats, loads and loads and loads of entries in there for feeding the horses.
Hmm.
But
That
if you can
makes
imagine
sense.
that, that's a microcosm of an army, in terms of times it by
Right.
10 or 100, and you've got a medieval army.
Yeah. And I know with the cut grass, we were talking more specifically about sort of war horses or high end performance horses. But then, obviously there's many other kinds of horses that existed with other
Hmm.
other disciplines, other uses, and so
Yeah,
um, yeah, it's like 10 different types of feed they might have needed depending on
yeah.
the
I think
group.
it's allowances, and it's usually measured in bushels. Um, I can't remember the exact term. I broke it down into what that actually meant, but it's mares were getting less, which is even though they were still working and breeding and producing young stock, they would get less than the stallions. But it's usually amounts as well. So it'd be amounts of hay plus oats and
Yeah.
and other bits and pieces as well.
Going back to the grass thing, and I know this wouldn't be answered in primary sources, but do we know anything about how the actual like composition of the grass differed from then? I mean, because nowadays, you plan the field and you're aware of
Yeah,
exactly like the type of grass that's in it, and
yeah, yeah,
you know,
exactly.
you,
So yeah, they had a big awareness of what land was good and beneficial herbs as well. So anecdotally, Walter Henley's good for this. So there's bits and pieces in terms of how long it should take people to weed a field.
hmm,
So your farm management. So they're obviously aware of like getting rid of non-desirable plants such as thistles or ragwort or anything else that's nasty. Nowadays, obviously, we just do it by chemical. Back then, they didn't have that option, so they they weeded it, and they recommend not weeding before a certain feast day. I can't remember which one it was in the year, because otherwise it will just come back again. So weed after this point. Um, but yeah, so they were aware of pasture management and making sure that there's better stuff in there and different pastures for different abilities, whether they're by the sea and estuaries and things like that. So they've got some sort of saline content. But back then, obviously, the management of the pasture would be purely manual. So they would take out the things that are really bad, but then horses would have they would have access to everything else that was there that grew wild, grew in a wild form, and they won't. won't generally eat anything that's really bad for them. They'll avoid ragwort. If you miss a piece of ragwort in the field, even if there's not much grass, they won't eat it. Ragwort poisoning is an issue nowadays when it's not managed properly and it's harvested and it gets stuck into some hay and the horses accidentally consume it. Or even if they're so hungry, I don't think that they'd eat it because it's horrific stuff. But in terms of what they awareness of beneficial herbs and everything like that, I think it's kind of gone full circle, because nowadays you can buy these small like balls or herb packs that you put up in as a hay net, that supplements, natural supplements that you give your horse. But back then, these plants were all in the meadows and the hedgerows, and the horses selectively ate them. So they were aware of that. I think they're much more in tune with the natural world than we are today, obviously.
Oh, that's fair. And yeah, I think in general, even our own human food supply, I think we've gone, it's like too far in the direction of, we weed and use chemicals until everything is dead except that one, one type of grass we want, or, like our perfectly manicured lawns, right? It doesn't really reflect what it probably looked like.
No,
then.
and you look in the countryside as well. I live in very rural Norfolk. I've got a small holding. Our land is managed naturally. We weed it. We don't use any chemical fertilizer, so it's a haven of wildlife. But around me is what you call an agri-baron, so a big commercial farm, and it is, the land is utilised to within an inch of its life. People look at it who aren't familiar with it. They think, oh, it's beautiful countryside. No, it's just as well. It's just as managed as an urban environment. Every inch of that land is controlled in terms of its fertilization, its cropping, and its pest control. But you just don't see that because the tractor drives around once every 3 months, and it looks like a big field full of cereal, but it's completely man-made.
Yeah, and given the cost and value of horses at that time, I think we can rest assured that they were engineering the safety and feed of the horses, as much as they could.
I mean, it's very valuable assets. So definitely.
So that might be then a good opportunity to switch gears, because I do want to talk specifically about your interest in Iberian horses, and specifically, since we know they were imported into England for many years in the Middle Ages, how the heck did they do that?
Right. So if you think about it, well, England's an island. They would have had to get on a boat at some point, but there's sea trade routes which are well documented between the Mediterranean and Iberian countries, and there's a land route, obviously, from the Iberian Peninsula through France and places like that over the sea. Incidentally, before we kick off on the medieval period, I knew of a Lusitano that was local to me who was ridden back from Portugal in the 90s, all the way from Portugal to Norfolk. There's two of them. And he passed away only a few years ago. He's well into his late 20s. I might even been 30, but it was owned by people I know locally. So yeah, they were ridden back. So it can be done, even in the 90s. But I think going back to the medieval period, if you look at cross-land transport, so much risk in terms of like wear and tear on the animals. For a start, you got the risk of volatile political situations, or domestic crime, being robbed, losing animals, and then you've got things like taxes and tolls. Every time you pass through a principality, you're going to be charged to move your goods, i.e. the horses, through it. So in terms of feasibility of moving animals from all the way down in the south of south of Europe, in the southwest, in the Iberian Peninsula, all the way up to England, I think it's not really feasible. I'd not really read any medieval instances of when it was done. Most of it, I think, went through the sea trade, and there was a number of routes. So there's one all the way around from the south of Spain directly to Bristol, I think, with no stops, and then there was another route from the northern Spanish coast that went up the western seaboard of France. And it's interesting to note as well that it's multinational teams of people, so you could get Italian merchants with English sailors on the ships, or Spanish merchants, or all sorts of people plying the route all the way around and down. And the route that hugged the coast of France often serviced other ports as well, so they called in and either picked up or dropped off stuff, including places. They went to places like Bruges as well, so they went to the Netherlands and the Holy Roman Empire and those sorts of places. But in terms of the logistics, you're talking a number of weeks really to do that. That actual trip is a risk in itself. There is a risk in moving by sea, the much smaller ocean-going vessels that are very susceptible to tide and wind and things like that. But detail in terms of how horses were housed there's an interesting document that comes from the 13th century. It's a series of documents based around Louis IX's crusade and other people who were moving horses from the south of France to the Holy Land as part of a crusade. I mean, obviously Richard the Lionheart went by sea as well, took his horses with him. So these documents are interesting because they have a specific. They have a couple of different types of ships described. One is a specific horse transport ship. It's kind of like a combat landing craft, if that makes sense. So it had I have to look up the word. I think it's a terida. That's it. Yes. And they were built as oared vessels, galleys with a drop back, so short distances. And knights were known to. They were recorded in multiple instances of riding off the back of those straight onto an enemy held beach and taking the beach. So we're talking about short, sort of like combat landing craft, Higgins boats from the Second World War, with a decent draft and a drop down ramp where they could ride off the back. So they were transported short distances in those, but also there were other boats for longer distances, sort of round bottom boats, traditional cog type ones that you would see in all throughout Europe, and they were fitted out. Now, what's interesting about this document is it's got dimensions of how much or how wide the equestrian space is and how much water they take on board and all this sorts of stuff. And one thing they say is that the horses would generally, and there's other anecdotal mentions of this, they were generally suspended under their bellies with canvas slings. Now this sounds a bit bizarre, but you think about it, the violence. I mean, it's bad enough putting a horse in a trailer or a lorry, and traveling wears horses out. It takes it out of them. It can do,
Mm-hmm.
and that's on a flat road. With a modern vehicle, you imagine sticking them in the hull of a medieval ship that's rocking and pitching and rolling, actually supporting them and taking the weight off their legs and sort of holding them suspends them, and it de-risks their kind of travel. So they were so there's strong indication that they were slung in terms of carried in a sling for the duration of the journey. Which is
Wow.
going to be very. It's going to have to take a trusting horse to do it. But it makes sense that there's so much risk of accident. The only way I think you could do it is to box them in really securely, like in a so they can't like fall over. But even then, there's risks. So there's that. I think they were loaded via. I've seen 15th century imagery of being loaded by a crane with a sling underneath them as well, and that was done right up until the 19th, 20th, early 20th century as well. Horses were onboarded and off-boarded ships with a crane and a sling. I think that goes back a long time, and obviously for that you're going to need a deep water port with a decent draft and quayside facilities. Which, if you're importing valuable horses, that's not a problem. You're not landing on an enemy-held beach ready to take it.
Yeah. Those are two very different
Yeah.
scenarios.
But they're mentioned both in similar sorts of documents. But they're both quite interesting. But yeah, certainly in moving them from Iberia to England, cost is going to be a lot. It's going to be quite high. But you're talking about animals that are absolutely top of the tree. I mean, if you were to equate them to cars or motor vehicles today, you look, Ferraris, McLaren F1s, like really high-end performance cars, less than 1% of the animals in the country by far. There's You're really limited in terms of who could own these horses to the royalty and the upper echelons of nobility, mainly because of cost, but also you've got diplomatic considerations as well. A horse is a habiliment or an accoutrement of war. In this case, so certainly when you're buying destriers and coursers, which are specifically mentioned in terms of buying them. So there's going to be export restrictions from places like Spain, either because they want to keep the horses themselves for their reconquesta, their wars against the Moors in the south of Spain, or because in the 14th century, they fell out with the English and sided with the French. So they said, no, you can't really have any of them, but we'll let you off because you're the King of England. We'll give you a few Castilian horses if you want them. But so there's that kind of control. So there's the financial, high financial cost to get a horse back from. So you've got to send a guy over there to get it. You've got to say, buy me this. He's got to buy it, then he's got to get it back again, and that's going to cost lots of money. And they're buying sometimes 50 horses at a time in the late 13th, early 14th century. You've got to get it back, but it's also like the diplomatic impact of getting a horse back. It's not just the physical transportation. It's dealing with that and having those safe passages between nations that are potentially hostile or not really speaking to each other.
Right. So, yeah, certainly, depending on the time period, it makes sense to have traveled by sea if the English are avoiding France or,
Yeah.
other issues on a
Yeah.
land route.
Yeah, I think pretty much they would come by sea, and I think it's probably done a lot more than we thought. But yeah, I think that's the way it's going to be done, and it's probably going to be transporters that are going to be specialised in terms of moving horses around, like we have today.
Right. Yeah. Nowadays, if you have enough money, you can FedEx your horse just about anywhere in the world.
That's interesting. I've been to a horse layover place near Liège when I was on the way to Germany in 2019, actually, and it was crazy because it was a hub that was geared up for flying out international show jumping horses, and that's what it was there for, and it would be this place with these fantastic like multi-million-pound horse lorries and just parked there, no horses because they'd all gone off to, I don't know, Dubai or wherever they were doing their show jumping, and they flew out and they flew back in, and it's just this horse transport hub near Liège. So yeah, it's a different world, really.
Yeah. Yeah. As far as the Iberian horse in England, what specific time period were you looking at where they were being imported in the greatest numbers?
So I think there's probably a bit more to be done on this. So I'm always looking, I'm always improving it and looking at new stuff. I think obviously they've been around in England certainly since the 12th century. I mean, there's talk of that the Normans brought them over. I think probably they did have some Spanish stock as well. But certainly by the time you start reading the history of William Marshall, he's mentioning Castilians a lot. And in other parts of Europe, in early sort of 13th century, the Castilian horse is almost ubiquitous in terms of its mention. But I think within England, it really ramps up in the late 13th and early 14th century. So you've got a steady increase under Edward I throughout the second part of the 13th century, and then when Edward II comes to the throne, he really, really buys into horse breeding and horse importation a lot, and that's where you see a lot of these royal stud records come up. And that's where the peak of the purchasing was. I mean, he was sending agents across to Spain and other places almost every year to buy tranches of horses. I mean, it's certainly every other year by the 1310s, the 1320s, and then it really comes to kind of a head in about the 1330s when it just tails off quite a lot until Henry VIII comes onto the throne and picks up the rebuilding of bloodstock within England. Is mentioning about horses being basically just small and rubbish and this kind of thing. So Henry VIII, it reinstigates a lot. Obviously, we've got a big period of civil turmoil in England throughout the 15th century. The Wars of the Roses that rumbled on for a long period of time. So the conditions for importing horses from anywhere wouldn't really be that necessarily favourable. But yeah, in terms of Spanish horses coming in, I think it sort of peaks in England in the 1320s, 1330s, and then just kind of tails off.
And it sounds like, from what you can tell, that is more just related to internal English politics rather than there wasn't any kind of like decree against it. It just
No, there wasn't a decree. I mean, I think in terms of like you're obviously looking at really sort of people from the upper echelons of society who are doing it anyway, so they'd set the rules. But I think there's several theories as to behind what it could be. So it's rumored that the Spanish horses weren't big enough; they need to be bigger horses. I don't think that's necessarily true because they were being used in France and other places like that as high-end destriers as well. So, and size isn't a relative factor, necessarily a relative factor in weight bearing ability. But you've got competition from other places. You've got competition from Italy. Italian horses are coming in quite a lot. They're mentioned again in William Marshall in the 12th century, and Matthew Paris mentions Italian horses. And then you've got a later part of the 13th century. Under one of the Henrys, you've got Lombardic horses coming in as well. So there's competition from the Italian breeds, but also there's this kind of big investment into royal studs. So I think there's a good potential that they basically bought a large amount of foundation stock to stave having to go to the source to breed locally, either crossbreed with local mares, or to continue purebred Spanish horses, so to speak, in England. And what's really funny about that, what's interesting, if you read Pietromonte later on in the 15th century, he specifically says if you take a Spanish horse and a Spanish mare to somewhere like France, you'll just create bad horses. They won't be any good. They've got to come from Spain. So it's quite funny. But I don't know how true that was in terms of whether the homebred Iberian bloodstock replaced imported stuff, or whether there was competition from other breeds, or whether there was things such as we did have a bit of a fight with the Spanish in the second half of the 14th century. Allied ourselves with Portugal, Spain was with France, so it could be that as well. I haven't actually yet looked at, unfortunately, haven't found any decent source materials for Portuguese imports, so that's definitely something on my list that I'm looking for. A lot of it is Anglo-Castilian trade, so it would be interesting to see if Portuguese imports were affected in the same way, because you're looking at genetically very similar types of horses to Spanish horses. But yeah, so I think it's interesting thinking about the different types of horses. Italian horses, which I'm obviously a big fan of, as well as the Iberians. They're quite much vaunted in the second part of the 15th century in England. Chaucer mentions a Puglian or Poil, as it's spelled in 15th century England, Puglian Neapolitan horses as being really good as coursers. There's veterinary texts from later part of 15th century England that say basically Italian coursers, Puglian coursers are the best. That's where you go for them. So it could be that there was a fashion shift from one part of Europe to another.
Although, of course, Italian horses really would have not been that much easier to import either, right? I mean, it's still a
it's still a very long journey. But yeah, it's the same people. I don't think it's a logistical issue that we're facing. It's more of a probably taste. What was required, or potentially some sort of diplomatic thing. I don't know, but yeah, certainly I would expect to see a lot more Italian horses in the sort of later part of the Middle Ages in England, and potentially less Spanish ones. So,
right, and then later on, Henry VIII, when he was young, I know was quite the jouster aficionado, horse aficionado. So he sort of revived it.
Yeah, and he was a progressive king in a lot of ways in terms of re-evaluating English institutions such as the armor making stuff at Greenwich, the navy, rearming the country basically, and horses. They reassessed equestrian stocks and found them wanting. So he was importing all sorts of stuff, but he was also gifted lots of horses because he married Catherine of Aragon. So he had interfamilial ties with a nation. So I know he's gifted Spanish horses then, and they would have been favourably looked upon. So he reinstituted it. And then obviously you've got people like later on, you've got William Cavendish, who are really big advocates of the Spanish horse. And they come back in. So I just think there's that blip in the 15th century when we didn't really have that many of them in the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if anything else surfaces over time, specifically in regards to that time period in England. So then let's go to the modern day. So like if we look at many of the popular breeds in England now, the English breeds, do they have Iberian blood?
It depends how you look at it. So I've always thought that the Connemara, which is a native Irish breed, they look very Iberian. They've got that, well, they look like they've got Iberian traits to them. And sometimes if you go to Portugal, you'll see Lusitano horses that are all different shapes and sizes. They're all purebred. The first time I went over there, I saw some they looked like thoroughbreds. I'm like, oh, I don't really want that. But no, they were purebred. So they come in all shapes and sizes, and some of them, particular bloodlines, do tend to look a bit like Connemara's in terms of their short, stocky, powerful, athletic, and similar sorts of features. So I think there was a good trading link. I mean, there's this myth that the Spanish Armada was washed around the coast of Ireland and the horses swam ashore and mated with the local ponies. I think that's a bit of a myth. I think there's probably there's more trading links with Western Ireland via the routes that I mentioned. So horses were coming in to Ireland as well. And the Irish were importing Arab horses into the 19th century as well to improve local bloodstock. So I think there's Connemara's, but in terms of other native English breeds, or native breeds, not so many, but if you think about the origins of the thoroughbred racehorse and its Barb ancestry, and then you look at the Barb ancestry of the Spanish horses, from North Africa, came with blood introduced from North Africa, there's a genetic similarity there in terms of some sort of base material. So in terms of, I think there's part-bred horses in this country that have been produced in a modern cross. I don't think they're particularly popular over here, crossing Spanish horses with others. I mean, the big one that people know about is obviously the Warlander, which is the Spanish cross Frisian or Lusitano cross Frisian. That's not really done, I don't think, in England so much. But yeah, in terms of genetics, Barb ancestry very diluted back in the day, but also a few native breeds have kind of been improved. I think Spanish horse blood gets to a lot of breeds to improve them, because it's such a solid and reliable and also beautiful breed of horse, that they're very, very functional, very trainable, brave, and athletic as well. They can do some things that people don't know horses can do, really. So they've been used a lot.
Right. Well, certainly you don't need to sell me on the benefits of the Iberian horse. I myself am a Lusitano fan.
Yeah.
Like a few more if I could.
Yeah.
And obviously you have. I guess tell me a little bit about your horses then.
So we've got 9 here at the moment, and that's my job full time, is to manage them and do things like this and do research and everything like that. So we've got 4 Lusitanos, 2 retired geldings who are well into their late 20s, who I've had for many, many years, and they're happy living out. I've got 2 stallions who are in full work, Lusitano stallions. I've got an Andalusian stallion who is my dressage horse, and we've got 3 Murgese horses from southern Italy. So one is a famous, or maybe I should say infamous, jousting horse, Zogo, who has done a lot of stuff in Europe and a lot of events with me, but he's now retired from the jousting scene, but is still under saddle and still ridden daily, still used for rossfechten and mounted fencing and things like that. And we've got 2 colts. I went down to Puglia in Italy last year. And that was a very, very interesting experience. And I mustn't forget the 9th is a Welsh Section A, which Welsh horses, but they've so so we've got 8 Iberians and 1 Welsh pony. But the Italian horses are very interesting, and I think there's only about 8 or 9 of them in this country. The Italians would pronounce it Murgese. It's from the landscape where they come from, and they're a very sort of stocky, hardy but athletic breed as well, in a lot of ways reminiscent of the Portuguese Lusitano and some of the Andalusians. But yeah, it's I think the Italian breeding community in southern Italy is a few generations behind where the Portuguese are in terms of establishing the bloodlines and rebuilding them, because obviously Italy and the Iberian Peninsula, you look back to the start of the 19th century when Napoleon invaded, ravaged a lot of the traditional bloodstock and stole it, and a lot of it was killed and stuff like that. So these breeds have had to be rebuilt from selected small pools, and I think the Italians are trying to redevelop their horse back into the great Neapolitan war horse that it was. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there and how these 2 youngsters turn out. So they're only 3; they're not under saddle yet. So hopefully I'll be starting them this year if everything's okay. And hopefully one of them will be suitable for jousting. So
Very good. Yeah, you've got some projects ahead of you
Yeah,
then.
yeah, a lot of work.
A
Yeah.
lot of horses to keep ridden.
Yes.
And yeah, obviously, then you're sort of a representative in a sense of the Iberian horse in England, and there's not that many of them, not that many people in England that are aware of Iberian horses and interested in riding them. So, is that do you feel like that's something that's grown over the last 10 years or so, or?
Absolutely. So I think so. Yeah. I mean, the Spanish horses. I don't have exact figures, but I think you're talking about a few thousand in this country, and they're much more well known. PREs are known, or Andalusian.
Mhm.
Lusitanos, it's probably a few hundred. Last time I looked, it's about 400ish, but they are rising in popularity, so I'd expect it to be a bit more than that now. So people have they've discovered them. Really, they've found out what wonderful horses they are, and you can get you can get a lot of horse for your money in terms of what it can do, its abilities, its qualities. You go to Portugal, and it's bizarre because I mean you see everything from like big breeding farms where there's loads of horses and everything like this to people that have got horses stuffed almost in their garage. But some of them are extremely high quality and very well ridden. There's a very strong riding culture in Portugal. I mean, it's not that many people that ride, but I think the base level of riding is like I hate to say it's so much better than in England in terms of like what they expect people to be able to do, like all the lateral work and everything like that. So that's just a no-brainer. The horses can do it and the people can do it, and over here it's different, and there's different focuses as well. So in England we're very much driven by flat racing and the racing industry and eventing and things like that, where you basically the traditional, more recent cavalry work where you're riding fast in a group in a straight line, essentially, and horses that are developed for that. So, yeah, it's different. But the Lusitano, I think, sorry, going back to your previous question, I'm waffling somewhat, is that they are much more popular. Lusitanos and Andalusians are much more recognised nowadays, and I think certainly in things like dressage, judges are knowing to look at them. There's big advocates of the Iberian horse. So Stephen Clark in the dressage world in England is very into Lusitanos, and a big fan of them. So they've also had a lot of high level successes recently in terms of they're getting out there about this. So they're much more well known, which obviously makes them more desirable, which pushes the price up. That sort of thing. So I mean, when I first bought my first Luso sort of 20 odd years ago, you know you were getting an awesome amount of horse for your money for very little money, really. I think it's changed now, especially with the recession that happened in Portugal a few years ago. A lot of breeding was curtailed, so there's not so much choice. But yeah, they're becoming much more popular in the UK. They're much more recognised. You don't have to explain where a Lusitano comes from quite so much. And it's like, I've got Lusitanos. Are they from Spain? No, they're from Portugal. But yeah, I think they are becoming much more on the radar. There's a whole series of dressage that is just for Iberian. So MCI dressage is an international framework of dressage targeted at Iberian horses, which is very popular.
Mhm. And you yourself have done some working equitation too, as well, haven't you?
Yeah, I really enjoyed Working Equitation. I competed nationally at that. I didn't have a horse that was at international level at that point, but I was certainly lined up to do that before I stopped. And yeah, I've trained for a number of years in it around and competed around the country, and seen it internationally as well. Seen the international competitions in this country and in Portugal, and it's a fantastic sport. It's one of the best things that I think will prepare a rider for rossfechten and mounted combat. Is in terms of looking at how they're asking a horse to work, the tasks they're giving it in terms of the way it moves, they're all directly applicable to what you would want to be able to do in a fencing competition or a life or death struggle in terms of turning and moving your horse. So I school all of my horses in working equitation for the obstacles, even the dressage ones. They all get taught it because it's a great syllabus to build them up for other things as well. It gives them something interesting to do other than just flat work.
No, I definitely agree that I think if you had to pick a discipline that's the closest to what you need for rossfechten, that's modern, that is competitive, then I agree. Working equitation
Yeah.
is definitely it with the stop start and the tight turns and a
Yeah.
high level of control at a canter for sure.
Yeah, and also thinking about where you're putting your horse. So, it's like maneuverability as well. So when you're fencing, you're fighting against someone, it's not necessarily thinking about it is turning, but when you're certainly at distance, it's positioning yourself and how you would ride to where you want to be in an optimum situation. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of good things about it. But yeah.
Yeah, and just being the horse being unafraid of a variety of different
Mm,
obstacles, things that make noise, things they have to
mm,
walk on,
yeah.
all sorts of stuff that's well outside of typical dressage 20
Yeah.
meter circles.
Yeah. But the good thing about working equitation is, the dressage principles still apply. They're still looking for high quality of work. So in terms of the quality of the canter, the trot, the paces, the accuracy of the
Mhm.
transitions, everything straightness of the horse, it's all based and judged on a dressage basis, which means that, if you are a competition rider, there's no detriment into the schooling that you're doing to your horse. You're just adding other elements to it, and you're just doing bits and pieces that, you might end up doing in dressage test anyway.
Right, right. I agree. And you've spent, tell me a little bit more. You've spent some time in Portugal. Obviously, you've picked out horses before to buy and bring back with you.
Yeah.
But I know I specifically want to bring up that I know you've been to Sintra. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I was staying in Sintra actually. I had a horse in training out there at that time, and sort of getting past a certain age, I think I don't want to slum it and sleep in a rough hotel. I'll pick a nice one. So I picked a nice boutique held in the hotel in the center of Sintra, center of Sintra, and obviously I was only riding sort of once or twice a day, so I had plenty of free time on my hands. I was out there by myself, and I just thought, what should I do? And I looked around and I thought, actually, that's Don Duarte's palace over there. I can see it from my hotel room. Why didn't I think about this? So obviously I just toddled off over there and had a look around it, and it's quite fascinating really to be in the chapel, which I think was 14th century it was put in. So I know he's prayed there. I know he's been there, and just to walk around, it's obviously a palace that's had modernization um, throughout history. But yeah, it's compact and it's. I mean, I should imagine it gets bakingly hot, but that's where the Portuguese royalty headed out to when it was too hot in Lisbon. But yeah, it was a fascinating little find tucked away in the centre there. Very interesting. There isn't much equestrianism in terms of like to relate back to his writings and things like that, but just to go to where someone whose work you've read a number of times is really quite cool.
Yeah, no, I think that's very cool. Yeah, there's no riding hall to visit, but you can
No,
walk around and tour where uh, Dom Duarte was and
yeah,
lived.
yeah.
And it's not far from Lisbon, correct? I mean, it's like a
No,
day
no,
trip.
it's a bit west of it, yeah. So it's just
Hmm.
outside the city. It's not massively too difficult to get to.
Yeah, well, it's definitely on my list now of
Yeah,
future trip to Portugal. We'll have to make sure I
yeah.
stop there. Yeah. Um, so maybe let's talk just a little bit more about mounted combat to finish up. So
Hmm.
I know, part of what sort of set off me wanting to do this podcast with you was just recently, we were at Historic Equitation in England, and
Yeah,
you did a lovely mounted combat workshop or seminar for the weekend, which I thought was really nice that it had a big variety of people, some
yeah,
who have a tremendous amount of mounted combat experience, and then others that really had none and were
yeah.
just dipping their toes in it for the first time. So, any sort of practical advice for people who do want to get started in mounted combat?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that because we had quite a wide range of people. I think it's something that's really appeals to a lot of people. So in terms of practical advice, I mean, obviously just getting as much riding time as you possibly can, doing stuff like working equitation um, is really useful. Um, but because the one of the big difficulties about mounted combat is, I mean, I think you can do it to a certain level without a massively advanced equestrian skill set. Obviously, if you are able to terre canter on the spot, so to speak, almost, and canter pirouette, flying changes, all those sorts of things, if you're able to do those, you're going to be a huge advantage to someone who can't. But that doesn't preclude someone who can't do these things from working on it. But in terms of the biggest barrier, I think, certainly for people that are riders, is having that kind of knowledge of the sword, which you could learn on the ground, but also having that body isolation. So when you're on a well-schooled horse, they pick up everything from the way you put your weight, how you contract your stomach muscles, how you roll your shoulders back, all those sorts of stuff. So if you're in the middle of a fencing duel and you're actually using your right arm to its its full extent, you've really got to be able to isolate that movement from what you're telling the horse. So sort of working on your core body isolation, and how you would move around without necessarily affecting what you're telling the horse is something that you could work on. So those kind of things on the ground are useful, for people who are established riders and want to do a bit of fencing. Obviously, understanding the fencing is a key thing as well. So you can learn and practice on the ground without being anywhere near a horse. But for people who are hemorists or who are fencers already, unfortunately, I think you've got quite an uphill struggle, because it's so much harder to learn to ride to the level you need to than it is to use the sword. That shouldn't stop you from wanting to do it. But I think one of the biggest things, and this is what I would always tell someone who was historically minded and perhaps fenced, is don't ride just because you want to do the mounted combat. Ride because you love riding. If you try riding and you hate it, you are never going to do rossfechten, because you're going to have to put hours and time and effort in to working with the horse. If you do it and you love riding, then you're on a much more secure path to being able to do mounted fencing properly, because you're going to want to ride, you're going to want to put those hours into the saddle, you're going to want to learn. And I think that's one of the key things in terms of that people want to try it and have a go at it, but it's very difficult from an equestrian perspective to do. You've got to want to love to ride horses as well, really.
No, I think that's a very good point, because certainly for every 1 hour you might spend actually doing rossfechten, sword and horse at the same time, there's a lot of hours you need to put into just riding the horse, before that's a possibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. Yeah, and
I don't mean to make it exclusive or elitist or anything like that. It's just that's the way it is. You're telling a 600 kilo animal, you're asking a 600 kilo animal to do what you want off of a load of fine motor controls, and you've got to have a certain skill set. You've got to build that up to get to that point. But
right.
If you want to do it, then you want to do it, but just do it because you enjoy it as well, rather than just thinking, I want to fence on horseback.
Right. I suppose in some ways, and we both do harness fechten as well, so armored combat on foot, and it's much similar, right? That there's many people that are interested in it, but I always say, well, don't go drop $5,000 in armor, and then decide you don't like it, right? Go ahead, get involved, start learning, do it, without the gear, or even, and then figure out if you like it, and then put in the time and money commitment. But I'm also a HEMAist, and I've done a lot of teaching HEMA folks, at least the sword play out of the mounted combat section, which is very doable on foot. Because it's not that different from anything else in HEMA. It's just you need to know a few logistical things about how the horses approach each other, and the timing of the plays. So certainly, it is accessible on some level to anyone who's interested. But I definitely agree with you that if you don't like horses, if you're not a horse person, then I don't think you'll want to commit to what else it involves.
I think you'd struggle. You don't have to be incredibly determined to do that particular thing, or like I say, you'd have to do it because you like it anyway. So
and you've pretty much already answered this, but of course, then even though we are both big Lusitano fans, obviously you don't need an Iberian horse to do this. There are many kinds of horses. Almost any horse with the right training can participate in mounted combat. Much like I think dressage. Dressage is for every horse, right? It's training.
I think that too. I think obviously, if you've got a horse that's naturally athletic and can do these movements, or does them in the field when you watch them do it, it's like, then that's cool. But if you haven't, I think it generally kind of works better with horses that are short coupled, smaller horses. So I think anything like a big warm blood, or a long back thoroughbred would struggle a bit more. I mean, it's not to say you can't do it with those animals, but they're a little bit more genetically disadvantaged in terms of doing it. But what you can do is, if you haven't got a horse that's schooled up to do these kind of movements that would help you in a combat situation, what you can actually do is have a horse that is responsive to you. So most horses will go backwards. Most horses will do transitions neatly, or they can do transitions neatly. Most horses can move away sideways from the leg. And these kind of things, whilst they can do a lot of them can do a turn on the forehand, or other things as well. So a lot of these things don't necessarily to participate, certainly at a level that's not as advanced. These horses that are sharpened up, are listening to you, that are on the aids, that are doing the transitions nicely, that are off your leg, that are responsive to you and moving where you want them to move, they will be able to partake in mounted combat as well. And these are things that when you do a dressage test, they should help you. These are things that are looked for, horse in submission, horse in tune with its rider, responsiveness to the aids, all those sorts of things. So what I'm saying in a nutshell is good riding and accurate riding, and having a responsive horse will help you in rossfechten as well.
Well, I think that's very good advice. And kind of on that thread, for anyone who does want to start to experiment with their horse, maybe they're doing dressage or similar training, and they want to sort of get into that world. What any specific exercises or things that they should start to do with their horse to get prepared?
Well, it's quite hard because obviously, we're talking theoretically here about animals that are very different, and one exercise doesn't necessarily fit every horse. What I will say is responsiveness. So schooling your transitions, getting your horse to listen to you, so he or she will stop succinctly and promptly when you ask. They'll move away from your leg when asked. Obviously, being able to turn. Now, this opens up a bit of a Pandora's box, because some horses will be able to do like a 3 or 4 meter volte circle. Others won't. So you can't say. And obviously, you can hurt a horse by turning it too tightly outside of its physical abilities. So I don't want to say, turn your horse on a sixpence, because it might not be able to do it. But if in terms of being able to turn around, that's something that's really, really key. And whether that's a pirouette, whether it's a halt transition, and just your horse moving round and then facing your opponent promptly and in a way that is responsive to your aids. It doesn't have to be a canter pirouette. It doesn't have to be a fast turn like that. As long as your horse is listening to you and they're doing it to the best of their ability, you're going to get the maximum advantage. I would say, certainly in the UK, there's a lot of working equitation around now. That's something that has really been kind of pushed and is widespread in terms of accredited trainers around. Having a go or trying some working equitation and schooling would help you. Definitely, it'd get your horse out and about, and it would give you something to focus on in terms of working obstacles that will help your horse in rossfechten.
Right. And I don't think we even mentioned this yet, but of course, in working equitation, you're doing most of it one-handed.
In the advanced levels, yes, you are.
Also a prerequisite.
Yeah. Well, if you read some of the German texts, there's no hands on the reins, and it's like both hands on the sword or both hands on the lance, and things like that. So you're really relying on your horse being responsive to your seat and weight aids.
Yeah, for sure. And then, of course, you're also teaching. Again, is it in the fall at Historic Equitation?
Yes, yeah, I'll be then for a clinic. I've also got a number of clients as well who I help on a local basis individually, and various clinics pop up that I sort of teach, again, to the similar sorts of formats to what you experienced when we met the other weekend at Historic Equitation. But yeah, I'm back there in September, and I think there's some one-day ones as well, some shorter ones that Tom wants to run that I'll be involved with, that focus on specific things that are more aimed at people who have done a bit of it before.
Very good. So if anyone out there listening happens to be in England and wants to learn more about this, they can reach out to you. And
absolutely, yeah, I'm more than happy to evangelize about it, definitely.
And I'll make sure I have your web. I know you have your website and social media. I'll make sure that's in the show notes as well, so that
cool.
People know how to contact you. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
No, thank you very much for the opportunity. I saw when you announced this, I thought it was like a really good idea. I thought it was very cool. I thought, yeah, that's something that I'd really be interested in being involved with. And I've had ideas about doing a social media kind of thing for a while in terms of, but probably more formal, like videos in terms of YouTube presentations. But I think this is a really, really good format, and you're gonna get a lot of people with different viewpoints and pull them together, which is really, really interesting. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity. It's been really enjoyable, and I've enjoyed having to sort of like revisit some of my old notes, because it makes me think about things again that I haven't possibly thought about for a couple of years. So it's great.
Oh, well, you're very welcome. I'm happy to have you on this show. And you were, one of the first people I know that came to mind. So
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Very good.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Mike. You can find out more about his work online on his website, www.mikecanfor.com. That's MikeCanfor, and on his Instagram at Mike Canfor. For the podcast, please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. You can also access all of the episodes online on the podcast website, www.scholaequestris.com. There you can also find some resources for historical riding and mounted combat. Please share the podcast with your friends and leave us comments on who you'd like to see interviewed next, or what historical horse topics you just want to learn more about. So that's it for today. We'll see you next time on Schola Equestris, the podcast for mounted combat and historical horsemanship. Happy riding.